Moses, a divine calling to deliver a nation. The story of Moses is one of the most captivating and significant narratives in the Bible. From his birth, marked by challenging circumstances, to his death, which sealed a journey of faith and obedience, Moses was chosen by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt. His life is a testament to God's sovereignty and power to transform challenges into miracles, doubt into courage, and oppression into liberation. In this account, we will delve into his story, focusing especially on the plagues that struck Egypt, showcasing God's power and the fulfillment of his promises. The birth of Moses and divine providence. Moses' story begins during a time of great suffering for the Israelites. They had thrived in Egypt since the days of Joseph, but over the years, a new Pharaoh came to power who did not know Joseph. Fearing the growing strength of the Hebrew people, he enslaved them, imposing brutal labor to weaken them as a nation. Despite the harsh conditions, the Israelites continued to multiply. To curb their growth, Pharaoh decreed that all Hebrew baby boys were to be killed at birth. It was in this context of oppression that Moses was born. His mother, recognizing that he was a special child, hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer conceal him, she placed him in a basket coated with tar and set it afloat on the Nile River. Moses' sister watched from a distance to see what would happen. In an act of divine providence, Pharaoh's daughter discovered the basket while bathing in the river. Moved with compassion, she decided to raise the child as her own. Moses' sister seized the opportunity and suggested that a Hebrew woman nurse the baby, leading to Moses' own mother being hired to care for him. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, educated as a prince of Egypt, yet his Hebrew identity remained deeply ingrained in his heart. Moses' calling in the wilderness. Despite his upbringing in the palace, Moses felt a deep connection to the Hebrew people. In a moment of anger, he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew and buried the body in the sand. When he realized his actions had been witnessed, Moses fled to the wilderness of Midian to escape Pharaoh's wrath. In Midian, Moses found refuge with Jethro, a local priest. He married Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, and became a shepherd. For 40 years, Moses lived a quiet life in the wilderness, but God had greater plans for him. One day, while tending the sheep, Moses saw a burning bush that was not consumed by the flames. Intrigued, he approached it, and God spoke to him from within the fire. God revealed that he had heard the cries of his people in Egypt and was sending Moses to deliver them. Moses hesitated, feeling unworthy and inadequate for the task, but God promised to be with him. To strengthen his faith, God gave Moses miraculous signs and appointed Aaron, his brother, as his spokesperson. The confrontation with Pharaoh. Reluctantly, Moses returned to Egypt and confronted Pharaoh. Together with Aaron, he delivered God's command. "Let my people go, so that they may serve me in the wilderness." Pharaoh, however, hardened his heart and refused. Instead, he increased the burden on the Hebrews, demanding they continue making bricks without being supplied with straw. This caused even greater suffering among the Israelites, who began to doubt Moses. Yet God reaffirmed his promise to Moses. He would demonstrate his power through signs and wonders, showing Pharaoh that he alone was the Lord. Thus began the plagues of Egypt, each one a strike against the Egyptian gods and a testimony to the power of the one true God. The 10 plagues, God's power revealed. Water turned to blood. The first plague occurred when Moses, under God's command, struck the waters of the Nile with his staff. The river turned to blood, killing the fish and rendering the water undrinkable. This was a direct blow against Hapi, the Egyptian god believed to be the protector of the Nile. The plague of frogs. God sent a swarm of frogs that invaded every corner of Egypt, from palaces to humble homes. Although Pharaoh's magicians replicated the sign, they could not control the infestation, demonstrating the superiority of God's power. The gnats. At God's command, Aaron struck the dust of the ground, and it turned into gnats that infested both people and animals. Pharaoh's magicians were unable to replicate this miracle and declared, "This is the finger of God." The flies. The fourth plague brought swarms of flies that invaded Egyptian homes and land. However, God made a distinction. While the Egyptians suffered, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, remained free of flies, showcasing his protective power. The plague on livestock. God sent a deadly disease that killed the livestock of the Egyptians, yet the livestock of the Israelites remained untouched. This plague demonstrated the futility of the Egyptian gods, who were thought to protect animals. The boils. Following God's instructions, Moses scattered ashes into the air, and they caused painful boils to break out on the Egyptians and their animals. Even Pharaoh's magicians were afflicted and unable to stand before Moses. The hailstorm. God unleashed a hailstorm unlike anything Egypt had ever seen, destroying crops, livestock, and anyone left outside. Yet once again, the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was spared. The locusts. After the hail, God sent a swarm of locusts that consumed everything remaining in Egypt's fields. This plague devastated the Egyptian economy, bringing hunger and despair. The darkness. God brought darkness so intense that the Egyptians could not see one another for 3 days. Meanwhile, the Israelites continued to have light in their dwellings, further highlighting God's distinction between his people and the Egyptians. The death of the firstborn. The final plague was the most devastating. God announced that all the firstborn in Egypt would die, from Pharaoh's son to the child of the humblest servant. He instructed the Israelites to sacrifice a lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood so the angel of death would pass over their homes. That night, a great cry arose in Egypt as the firstborn of the Egyptians perished. Defeated at last, Pharaoh ordered the Israelites to leave Egypt. The Exodus and the miracle of the Red Sea. After the 10th plague, the Israelites departed in haste, taking with them the wealth that the desperate Egyptians gave them. However, Pharaoh changed his mind and pursued the Israelites with his army. Trapped between the Red Sea and the advancing Egyptians, the Israelites feared for their lives. But God instructed Moses to raise his staff, and the sea parted, allowing the people to cross on dry ground. When the Egyptians attempted to follow, the waters returned, destroying Pharaoh's army entirely. The journey through the wilderness, faith, trials, and divine provision. Following the miraculous deliverance from Egypt and the crossing of the Red Sea, the Israelites began their journey through the wilderness toward the Promised Land. This journey, however, was not without its challenges. The people quickly displayed a tendency to grumble, fearing difficulties and showing a lack of faith in God, even after witnessing great miracles. Soon after crossing the Red Sea, the Israelites faced a shortage of water. They arrived at a place called Marah, where the water was bitter and undrinkable. The people complained to Moses, and God instructed him to throw a piece of wood into the water, making it sweet and drinkable. This was the first of many divine interventions to meet the people's needs. Shortly after, the Israelites complained of hunger. Once again, God demonstrated his faithfulness by providing manna, a heavenly food that appeared on the ground each morning. He also supplied quail to supplement their diet. The instructions regarding manna taught the Israelites to trust God daily, as they were to gather only enough for each day, except before the Sabbath, when they were to gather double. The covenant at Mount Sinai. Upon reaching Mount Sinai, God summoned Moses to the top of the mountain to establish a covenant with his people. There, God delivered the 10 Commandments, written on tablets of stone, along with additional laws governing Israel's moral, social, and spiritual life. These commandments form the foundation of the relationship between God and his people, emphasizing his holiness and their need for obedience. The golden calf and the renewal of the covenant. While Moses was on the mountain, the people grew impatient with his absence and pressured Aaron to make a golden calf for worship. This act of idolatry angered Moses, who, upon descending from the mountain, shattered the stone tablets in indignation. Moses interceded on behalf of Israel, and in his mercy, God chose not to destroy the people. Instead, he renewed his covenant and gave Moses a new set of tablets inscribed with the commandments. During their time at Mount Sinai, God also provided detailed instructions for constructing the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where his presence would dwell among the people. Moses oversaw the building of the tabernacle according to God's exact specifications, and when it was completed, the glory of God filled the sanctuary. The spies' report and the consequence of unbelief. As they approached the promised land, Moses sent 12 spies to explore Canaan and report back. After 40 days, the spies returned, confirming that the land was fertile and abundant. However, 10 of the spies described the inhabitants as giants and the cities as impregnable fortresses. Only Joshua and Caleb displayed faith, urging the people to trust God to deliver the land into their hands. The people responded with fear and grumbling. Refusing to enter the land, they even considered returning to Egypt. This unbelief and rebellion angered God, who decreed that generation would not enter the promised land. Instead, they would wander in the wilderness for 40 years until all the adults of that generation, except Joshua and Caleb, had passed away. Korah's rebellion and other challenges. During the wilderness years, Moses faced ongoing challenges to his leadership. One of the most notable was the rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. These men questioned Moses and Aaron's authority, claiming that the entire assembly was holy and accusing Moses of exalting himself above the community. Their rebellion was met with divine judgment as the earth opened up and swallowed them, demonstrating that God had chosen Moses and Aaron to lead his people. This event, along with other trials, highlighted the ongoing struggle of the Israelites to trust God and follow his appointed leaders. God's dramatic intervention. In response to Korah's rebellion, God intervened dramatically. The earth opened up and swallowed the rebels alive, while fire consumed others who followed Korah. This event reaffirmed God's divine choice of Moses and Aaron as leaders and served as a solemn warning against rebellion. Yet, the Israelites continued to grumble against God and Moses on various occasions, often complaining about a lack of food, water, and comfort. Each instance of grumbling was met with divine provision, but also came with warnings and consequences for the people. The sin at Meribah and its consequences. One of the most significant moments of the journey occurred at Meribah, where the people once again complained of thirst. God instructed Moses to speak to a rock so that water would flow from it. However, in frustration with the people, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff instead of following God's command. Though water miraculously flowed, this act of disobedience had grave consequences. God declared that because Moses had not upheld his holiness before the people, he would not be allowed to enter the promised land. This moment underscored that even the most faithful leaders are called to complete obedience to God, preparing for the promised land. As the years of wandering drew to a close, God began to prepare the new generation of Israelites to enter the promised land. Aware that his mission was nearing its end, Moses devoted himself to teaching and encouraging the people. He delivered a series of speeches, recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, recounting God's deeds, reaffirming the laws, and calling the people to remain faithful. Moses also commissioned Joshua as his successor, entrusting him with the responsibility of leading the Israelites in conquering the land. In the presence of the entire assembly, Moses blessed Joshua and reassured the people that God would be with them just as he had been with Moses. Moses' death on Mount Nebo. At the end of his life, Moses ascended Mount Nebo, where God allowed him to see the promised land from a distance. From this vantage point, he gazed upon the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, knowing he would not enter it. There, alone with God, Moses died, and the Lord himself buried him in an unknown location. The Bible describes Moses as a man of undiminished strength and wisdom until the end of his life. He is remembered as the greatest prophet of Israel, a man who spoke with God face to face and led his people with unwavering faith and courage. Conclusion: the legacy of Moses. The story of Moses is not only one of miracles and deliverance, but also of God's faithfulness and the importance of obedience and trust in him. Moses' life teaches us that God chooses and equips imperfect people to fulfill his purposes. His story also reminds us that despite human failings, God's grace is sufficient. Moses was more than a leader. He was a servant of God who dedicated his life to obedience and to serving a greater purpose. His story inspires us to trust God in all circumstances and to live with the same courage and faithfulness. Just as God was with Moses, He is with us, guiding us through our own journey of faith and purpose.